All right. So, in a similar way to what we talked about with the male reproductive system, we'll talk about the parts of the female reproductive system, and we will talk about their function. Okay? So, to start, in the female reproductive system, we have the ovaries. So, as our question today covered, similar in some ways to the testes. Just like the testes, there are two ovaries in a woman. Okay? One on each side, a left and a right ovary. Unlike the male, they're inside of the body. Okay? They're not held outside of the body. So the ovaries' function is sort of two things. To hold eggs and also to produce some hormones, one of which is estrogen. Now, you'll notice I said something a little different. I said the ovaries hold eggs, and I didn't say they produce eggs. Do you know why I said it or phrased it differently? I think I mentioned it yesterday, Sophia.
Because I just forgot what I was going to say.
So I didn't say produce eggs, I said hold eggs. Kayla? Yeah, because in the ovaries at birth, all of the eggs are already there, and no new eggs are going to be produced. So what happens is they're sort of stored there in the ovary, and then after reaching puberty, then one egg starts to mature, okay, every reproductive cycle, but no new eggs are produced. They're all there from the beginning. Also makes estrogen the female sex hormone. The ovaries are located near these tubes that are called the fallopian tubes. They're also called the oviducts, is another term that you may see. They mean the same thing, fallopian tube, oviduct. So these oviducts, these fallopian tubes, they're the tube that's going to transport. When the ovary releases an egg, it travels through this fallopian tube until it reaches the uterus. So they transport the eggs as they're released. This organ is called the uterus, sort of a muscular pouch of an organ. And the uterus is what we would call the womb. This is where the embryo and fetus is going to grow and develop. Remember, the baby does not grow in the mother's stomach because that's filled with hydrochloric acid. That would be a horrible place for a baby. Okay? Yeah. It's in the mother's uterus is where the embryo and the fetus actually develops. So this is the uterus. The opening of the uterus down here is called the cervix. This is a passageway. Okay, connects the uterus to the vagina. We'll talk more about labor and delivery another day, but when someone is in labor and going to deliver a baby and they talk about how dilated the mother is, they're talking about the cervix. The cervix dilates to allow the baby to be born, because the baby has to move from the uterus through the cervix. Then finally, the vagina might also be called the birth canal. Okay, that's how the fetus is born. Moves from the uterus through the cervix, through the vagina. It's also where sperm is deposited to fertilize the egg. Sort of another view. Again, we have two ovaries connected to fallopian tubes to the uterus. The opening is the cervix, and then leaving the body is the vagina. to that brain power.
Why is Loki wearing hair?
It's the female reproductive system.
He's not a female. Well,
What?
yeah.
He had a wig on. We'll get to that at some point maybe. So, talk a little bit more about these. So the hormone estrogen is kind of the equivalent to what hormone in the male? Testosterone. It's the sex hormone. It regulates the menstrual cycle partially. It regulates the production of eggs and other various parts. It regulates the development of female secondary sex characteristics. And we know it's produced in the ovaries. And so the ovaries, as we said, they contain at birth about 400 or so eggs. So that's very different than in males. Males produce millions of sperm cells in the testes, whereas females only have several hundred eggs in their ovaries. And after puberty, what begins to happen is every month or so, one of these eggs that's already stored there in the ovary starts to mature. And as it matures, it moves to the surface of the ovary and it gets released. Gets released into the oviduct, into the fallopian tube. What do we call that process? So releasing an egg, there's a name for that. No? It's a part of the menstrual cycle, but that's not the releasing of the egg. Ovulation. So when an egg is released from an ovary, that is called ovulation. It happens within the menstrual cycle, but it's not the same thing. An egg is the largest cell in the female body. It's one of the largest cells. Compared to a sperm cell, it's many, many times larger than a sperm cell. And the egg cell, it has some of the mother's chromosomes in it. It has 23 chromosomes from the mother. The sperm cell that fertilizes it has 23 chromosomes from the father. And so when they combine, you have a mixture of chromosomes from both the mother and the father that produce the embryo. So if we look here at the diagram, we have the ovaries, which release the egg cell, goes into the oviduct or the fallopian tube. And this is where that egg can be fertilized. So after this ovary releases an egg, it slowly kind of travels through this fallopian tube. While that egg is there in the fallopian tube, if there are sperm present, they can make their way, and we talked earlier, when we talked about the male reproductive system, said those sperm cells have a journey to make. They have a long way to travel. That's why they have nutrients in the semen to allow them to get there. So those sperm cells are deposited in the vagina, but then they have to swim their way through the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, all the way up into the oviduct until they can reach the egg. And that's where they actually fertilize the egg. So fertilization happens up there. Now there is, we talked about in males, surgery a man could have if they no longer ever wish to have children. They could have a vasectomy. The doctor cuts the vas deferens so sperm cannot leave the body and make a woman pregnant. What's the equivalent sort of surgery that a female can have? If she no longer wishes to become pregnant, she could have surgery as well. Really? Yeah, sometimes it's called getting her tubes tied. The technical name would be called tubal ligation. And basically it's a similar sort of procedure. A doctor would do surgery. They would cut the fallopian tube on each side, okay? Sort of tie off or seal off the ends of the fallopian tube. So now when a woman releases an egg, it can't get down the oviduct, down the fallopian tube, and at the same time sperm cells can't reach that egg because that tube has been cut, and therefore she can't get pregnant.
Can they have a period and somebody has to?
Yep, so a woman would still get her period and all those other parts of the menstrual cycle, but no eggs can be fertilized. Therefore, she couldn't become pregnant. Sophia?
What if you get a hysterectomy?
A hysterectomy is a different type of surgery when they actually remove the uterus. Yeah. Sometimes women have their uterus removed for various reasons. And that's another type of surgery they have done. But generally not just for birth control. Like a tubal ligation is only so you don't get pregnant anymore. Hysterectomy is usually due to other symptoms a woman may have. So that process of the sperm cell combining with the egg cell, we have a name for that. What is it called when a sperm cell enters into an egg cell? We say the egg has been what? Fertilized. It's called fertilization. And it forms a cell that now has half of the chromosomes from the mother, half from the father. We call that cell that is produced a zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg. It's kind of interesting. Only a single sperm cell, even though a male would release millions of sperm cells into the vagina, only a single sperm cell can fertilize that egg. The surface of the egg has sort of a coating around it. And as soon as one sperm cell enters that coating, it immediately changes and becomes impermeable to any other sperm cells. Because it's important that that zygote has the proper number of chromosomes. If two sperm cells happen to enter the egg cell and to fertilize it, it would have the improper number, it would never grow. So it's important that just one sperm cell fertilizes that egg cell. And there's various ways that the egg has of ensuring that it's only one. After that zygote is formed, it starts to travel down the fallopian tube. The fallopian tubes have cilia in them, tiny little hair-like projections that sort of swim the zygote down the fallopian tube. Eventually, it makes its way all the way to the uterus. As this process is happening, a woman's reproductive cycle is going on. And in the time after ovulation, what the reproductive or the menstrual cycle is doing is preparing her uterus. And what happens is the lining of the uterus, the inside builds up, it gets thickened, becomes enriched with blood vessels. It's getting ready for what to happen? What would happen to that zygote if it were fertilized? Rania? Yeah, it would go down the fallopian tube and it would attach to the wall of the uterus. So the wall of the uterus during this time is getting ready for that. Okay? It's becoming enriched with blood vessels. But most of the time, the egg is not fertilized. And so that lining of the uterus that was getting ready for this zygote to implant, for this embryo, it's not really needed anymore because there was no fertilized egg. So what happens is it starts to break down. It starts to sort of disintegrate. And it's shed. The lining of the uterus is shed out of the woman's body. Okay. And what do we call that?
Period.
Period. That's what a menstrual period is, when the lining of the uterus, it's no longer needed because there's no fertilized egg, and therefore the woman's body sheds that lining. Okay? The uterus opens to the cervix, and then that lining and the egg, which wasn't fertilized, leaves the woman's body in the menstrual period. And then, after that, the whole process repeats again. A new egg starts to form and is released. The lining thickens, getting ready for this fertilized egg. If it's not fertilized, it breaks down. But, at some point, there may be a fertilized egg there. And if there is, what happens? So here we have all the various steps along the way. Here we have a tiny little immature egg. It starts to grow and mature. Eventually, it forms a follicle, which breaks open and releases this egg into the fallopian tube. That's ovulation. It starts to travel down the fallopian tube. This is when it can be fertilized. Okay? Okay, so if there's sperm deposited in the vagina during this time, when there is an egg in the fallopian tube, it can be fertilized by a sperm cell. Once it's fertilized, we call it a zygote. That zygote continues traveling. Then it starts to split. It goes from one cell, and it splits and forms two cells. Then those cells split, and it becomes 4, and 8, and 16, and 32. And it forms like a little ball of cells. That's an embryo. Eventually, after several days, it makes its way into the uterus. After about a week, it sticks to the lining of the uterus, which again has been thickened and enriched with blood vessels because it's going to support this embryo for the next 40 weeks or so. Okay? And then once it reaches this stage, we say then a woman's pregnant. The embryo is attached, it's implanted into the lining of the uterus, and it can grow into an embryo and a fetus and eventually be born to form a baby. And that's the process by which that happens. Okay, our last slide for today, again, this is kind of the side view. So we're not seeing 2 ovaries and 2 fallopian tubes and so forth. We're looking sideways, sort of. Here you have the spine, and you have the rectum. Okay. So we have the ovaries up here. It's only showing one because it's a side view.
So that's like from the hip.
Yeah, it's like looking into the head, yes. This is an oviduct, a fallopian tube. Then here we have the uterus.
What's that stuff around it?
Here,
Yeah.
that's like the abdominal cavity.
Wait, but you.
There would be like intestines and stuff in here.
Oh.
They're not shown that. The opening of the uterus down here, that's the cervix. Just in front of the uterus is the urinary bladder. Okay, right here. And then it should make sense why, when a woman is far along in her pregnancy, you might say, oh, I have to go to the bathroom all the time, my bladder's the size of a pea. Because as the baby grows inside of the uterus, presses on that bladder, compresses it.
Wait, so it's like really the size of.
No, it's not really, but the fetus as it grows puts pressure on it, so it's not, can't enlarge as much to hold as much urine. It's not really the size of the pea, but people say that. The cervix opens into the vagina. It's a tube that leads out of the body. The birth canal may be called. The urethra is here. This is the bladder, so this is the urethra. This is also one of the reasons, if you think about, when we talk about the male reproductive system, in males the urethra is much longer. In females it's much shorter. That's why women are more likely to get a urinary tract infection, which is a common infection that women get, because it's easier for bacteria to get into the bladder, into the ureters, because the urethra is much shorter. The pubic bone is a part of the pelvis. Okay, it's up here. Pelvis is actually made of several bones and can expand to allow the fetus as it's born to move through the birth canal. And then in the back is the rectum. Yeah, I know your diagram's a little dark, so it might be hard to see there, but you should feel okay. That's for next week, so I'm not going to spoil the surprise. I'll tell you about twins, fraternal twins, identical twins, and conjoined twins all next week.
Twin things are scary. Like on American Horror Story.
We'll review that next week.